Well, I just got in from the morning hunt here. Gonna make plans for the afternoon, but wanted to take a second and talk about wind and thermals. I am out of state right now. I'm in southeast Minnesota hunting, and beautiful bluff country, real cool topography, just awesome terrain, a lot of high ridges. And in my mind, the more topography you have like this, the more elevation changes, the harder it is to hunt from a wind perspective. You just get more inconsistencies. And so while I'm up here, I wanted to kind of talk about just, whitetail hunting in general, how the wind plays a role, how the thermals play a role. I think back to when I first started getting into bow hunting. I think it's an evolution that we all kind of go through, but early days I probably didn't think about wind direction at all. I just would go out and hunt. But then I started to play the wind and the wind direction only. I didn't pay attention to wind speeds, probably didn't even know what thermals were. I just would go out, thinking that whatever the weather app said or forecast said, that would be what the wind does, and I just need to make sure that that's not blowing towards the deer. And as you keep evolving in that process, thermals become a big part of it. And anymore, I think about thermals pretty much nonstop, and how I can play that into my advantage when I'm going in to hunt a certain buck. But backing up a little bit before I get into thermals, just talking about, let's say wind speed, wind direction. Obviously, the higher the wind speed, at least to a certain extent, the more consistency you're going to get directionally. So anything above 10 miles an hour, that 10 to 20 mile an hour range is going to be pretty consistent in terms of the direction, unless, and I'll get into this in a second, unless you're hunting a spot that the wind just tends to swirl due to the terrain or some type of feature based on the location you're hunting. But in general, those consistent wind speeds that aren't super gusty, but they're consistent, that 10 to 20 mile an hour, you're going to get pretty true wind. I love that 10 to 15 mile an hour sweet spot for me. Again, true wind, but also a very comfortable wind for deer movement. That's probably where I see the most deer movement. And you think about, anything a lot higher than 20, 25, if you're a deer walking through the woods, first of all, everything's noisy, the leaves rustling in the wind, trees blowing around, everything's moving. So it's harder for them to pick out danger. And while they do still move on those days, I just see it a little subdued, just because they kind of are paranoid about everything moving around in those high winds. On the flip side of that, a really low wind speed, under 5 mile an hour. I mean, we've all hunted probably those nights where it's just pin drop. I also think that creates some paranoia. I see subdued movement on those nights, and I can only assume that you just hear everything. Every noise is amplified and kind of freaks them out a little bit. So I don't like the completely calm days, and I don't like the super high windy days. I like kind of that sweet spot in between when it comes to deer movement. The other thing about those lower wind speeds, lower than 7-8 mile an hour, you're going to get some inconsistencies in the wind direction, first of all. And second of all, that's where your thermals are going to come into play. So that's what I want to talk about a little bit more in depth. Your thermals, a couple ways to think of them. They're going to fall in the afternoons as that air cools. It's going to bring your scent down, downhill. And then in the mornings, the opposite effect. As that air's warming up, that sun's coming up, warming the ground, that hot air is going to rise. And so you got to keep in mind a couple things. Again, for me, it's around that 7 mile an hour mark, 7 to 8. Anything less than that, your thermals are going to trump the wind direction. Anything more than that, the wind direction tends to trump the thermals. So think about a night, we've all probably been there, where maybe winds blow in the afternoon, but as evening gets near, sunset gets near, that wind dies down and is less than maybe 5 mile an hour. Your thermals at that point, as the air starts to cool, your thermals are going to pull downhill. And so always be thinking about that when you hunt a spot. And a really good example is if you're hunting, maybe on the edge of a ditch, your thermals, as that air cools, is going to fall to the low spot. Think about water. Think about where water would flow if you were to, have a bunch of it there. Where would it settle? It's that lowest spot, that lowest elevation is where your scent thermals are going to pull down in the evening. In the morning, it's the opposite. You have the sun coming up, warming the ground, that hot air is rising. It's going to rise uphill. And there's even another aspect that I've seen of that too, where, you know, depending on the angle that that sun's hitting, it's going to warm, and it's coming up in the east, it's going to warm kind of the western side of that hill, depending on exactly how that topography is. But that warm, and as it changes that angle, that's the order that that air is going to, or that ground's going to warm up to pull the air. So you might get some east-west movement in your thermals there too, but in general, your thermals are going to pull up in the morning as that warm air rises, as that sun warms the ground. And so a couple different examples I can try to pull from. One, an evening thermal example. The buck I killed a little over a week ago was a great example of this, because I was playing the thermals. I knew the wind was going to die down that night, and the way the terrain laid, everything kind of fell into this waterway. And the kicker to this is, this buck that I was hunting also thought he had that at his advantage. It's a really good spot for these deer to congregate, come out in the evening. He could smell everything around him because everything falls to him. The difference is I was just off of that on the creek bank, so instead of my thermals pulling out to that waterway he was so used to being in, my thermals pulled down into the creek, which is even lower. So that's how I was able to kind of, you know, if you can find those spots, they're few and far between, but you got to think about how, especially when you're targeting mature bucks, how can you have the wind that he feels is almost to his advantage, and it's almost wrong for you, but it's just off enough. Maybe it's just a quartering wind. You don't always want to think about, you know, what's the exact opposite wind that I need that he doesn't, because a lot of times you're going to find those mature bucks don't just walk with the wind at their back willy-nilly, unless, you know, there's a certain situation that leads to that, like a hot doe. But most of the time, especially in October, they're going to be a lot more calculated. So how can you just get off of that wind direction enough? And playing your thermals is a really good way to do that. In the mornings, like I said, it's kind of the opposite with regards to where your thermals are going. They're going to be rising, and, you know, it's just for a period of time. Again, the opposite example where it's really calm in the mornings and the wind speeds pick up around 8:30, 9:30. There's a time period there where the thermals are all going to be completely rising, and that's a situation I love, to be back in the woods, maybe in a spot that's a little bit iffy wind direction wise. You know, deer could come from everywhere. Those are the spots I'm going to go to on those calm, clear, cold mornings where I know that sun is going to be shining bright, going to be warming everything up, and I'll use that as an advantage to get into a spot like that that's hard to hunt otherwise. And to go a little bit further, I'll even use that opportunity, that time period where the thermals are trumping the wind speed. I'll use that for a calling opportunity, you know, maybe some blind calling, rattling, something like that, to where I know a buck comes in, he's not going to necessarily be able to get downwind of me because all the thermals are rising. It's going to be hard for him to pick up that scent. So, you know, thermals are a huge part of my hunting strategy these days, and I think if you start to understand them, you find spots that can work to your advantage and be just off to a buck's advantage, man, that's as good as it gets right there. And the other aspect too to this whole wind thermal thing is just the location itself. Again, this topography, like where I'm standing right now, you know, you're going to have more things that are going to direct the wind in different spots. It's going to come up over the top. One of the things that I've kind of learned the hard way is the way that wind will come up over the top and swirl within itself, especially coming up over a bluff, or maybe it's a block of timber that has a little opening. It's going to swirl back in that opening a little bit. The best way to describe that is if you think about running water, like in a creek or a stream. When it hits an obstacle like a rock or a log, you can see it eddy on itself, you know, behind that object. It kind of swirls back and goes against the current. That's what the wind will do when it comes up over an object like a big bluff or a a steep drop off or a steep edge, the steeper it is, the more you're going to get that action. If it's kind of a slow, gradual downhill, most of the time the wind's going to continue in that direction. But if you hit a steep edge, you about guarantee a wind coming up over the top is going to swirl back in. So, keep that in mind. And then, one other spot that's just really tough to hunt wind direction wise is if you're in a bowl, a low elevation spot surrounded by higher elevation all around. You're just not going to get a very consistent wind direction in that location. So that's another spot you could potentially go all in and play a rising thermal morning. So just a few things to think about. Like I said, I love that 10 to 15 mile an hour wind speed. My absolute least favorite wind is anything 5 miles an hour, 5 to 8 miles an hour out of the east. Just seems like there's so much inconsistency with that. A lot of times it means there's some type of front rolling in, and you get a lot of wind swirls in those conditions. So hopefully that's helpful. Wish you guys the best of luck this fall, and reach out if I can help.